I'm going to talk a little bit about risk. I'm going to talk a little bit about private trading networks, and then allow you to ask some questions. UST. So UST is a global IT service provider. We've got about 30,000 employees, and we'll be adding about 10,000 more this year alone. So one of the things, if I were to kind of draw your attention to one thing that makes UST different, is UST, the heritage of the company is around staff augmentation, IT services, offshoring, things like that. It's a much different organization today. Today, design, build, run, we do the whole scope of an IT support services. Why that's different is if you talk to a Bain, Booz, McKinsey, even Accenture, they don't have the understanding of how do I actually run this stuff. So we as an organization, we're not going to recommend something that we don't think we would be comfortable supporting in the long run. So the solutions that we work with our clients, we want to make sure that they're viable in the field. Offices around the world. We've got North America, South America, Middle East. We have a large contingent in India. Fun fact is I found out we actually have an office in Bentonville, Arkansas, which I think may know is where Walmart is headquartered. We got 400 people in the Bentonville, Arkansas office. Some of the customers that we work with, you can see the brands. Large organizations, high service organizations, and we're proud of every one of those relationships. So I have responsibility for the supply chain management practice, and we cover basically the end-to-end functions within the supply chain: design, plan, source, manufacture, fulfill, even service, returns, across a broad variety of industries, whether it's retail, manufacturing, high-tech, pharma, CPG, and we'll go anywhere from strategy formulation, business process design, through technology implementation and support. Okay. So I joined UST about 6 months ago, and my phone hasn't stopped ringing. There's never been a better time to be in supply chain. I've been in supply chain for 25 years, and I've never had as many people who want to talk about what's going on in the supply chain. So what's cool and what's not cool? Does anybody recognize the shoes on the left? Raise your hand if you do. One person? Well, I have 3 daughters, so what's hot is Golden Goose shoes. They cost about $650, if you can believe that. So what's hot in supply chain? Can you advance the slides, please? Transportation, inventory optimization, control towers, nearshoring. I will tell you that I'm getting more phone calls than you can imagine right now from customers that want to talk about demand planning. Everybody says, I'm never going to go through this pandemic like this ever again. Can't you give me some sort of better forecasting model that would have predicted a pandemic? The answer is no. We'll work with you. There are lots of innovations around machine learning and AI, but to think that there's a silver bullet planning solution out there is pretty optimistic. What I'm not hearing as much about, S&OP, RFID, lean, and I know that this is probably heresy to say it, but sustainability. I'm obviously from the US, right? So, but we don't hear about sustainability the way you do. And that's kind of like a tree torn for 35 euros. One of the things I thought would be interesting is to talk about this pandemic, but really talk about who got it right, who did well, and why did they do well in their supply chain. Henkel, you're familiar with Henkel? They do consumer adhesives, industrial adhesives. Most people know them for duct tape, but it's much bigger than that. Day one, when the pandemic hit, they shifted their sales and operations planning process. That alone wasn't enough. Years ago, Henkel was planning for redundancy. They were building factories, they had backup plans, they knew how they were going to manage the redundancy. As a result, revenue up 8%, operating profit up 4.2%, and EPS all up. This is in the middle of a pandemic. Who else did well? Tesla. Tesla put out more cars than they had ever before. Part of the reason that Tesla survived is because they have a highly integrated, vertically integrated supply chain. They're not as dependent on outside suppliers for components. And so, Ford came out at the end of last year and said, we're going vertically integrated. We're following this business model because we can't put so much at risk. It's kind of a good news, bad news story for Tesla, because what's going on in China, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, is really going to come back to hurt Tesla in their ability to actually source components. Toyota, they were the granddaddy of Lean, Six Sigma, Kaizen type manufacturing operations, but Toyota did very well as well. One of the reasons is they had this commitment to visibility, and they built a control tower, and they built a database so that they could instantly look up any supplier. If there was a risk in the supply chain, they could immediately tell you who that backup supplier was and how they were going to actually activate that. And then the other thing is they have what I call engineering thinking. When they engineer a car from the very beginning, they're planning all the way along. How am I going to be able to make it sustainable should I need to do that? So those are just 3 examples. You guys recognize this, right? Everybody raise your hand if you recognize what this is. Yeah. I got a fight with my marketing department over it. So they were like, what is that? Nobody's going to understand. I was like, yeah, the whole room's going to understand what that is. Here's what I find interesting about this. Well, first of all, my mother called me and wanted to talk about it. And how in the world is she even, into supply chain? I've been doing this for 25 years. She never wanted to talk about anything before. But seriously, the world was focused on this. This got so much attention as being, so problematic. Why? Why was it so problematic? Why did we not predict this? Why did we not expect that this could happen? It's happened 5 times in the past. One time it was shut down for 8 years. Yeah. The most recent time it was shut down is 2017. So we shouldn't be surprised by something like this. What we should be doing is thinking about resiliency. It's going to happen. It's going to happen again. And I disagree respectfully with the gal who was just on the stage talking about we're not going to go through shocks like this in the supply chain in the future, not like what we've just experienced. My answer, oh yes, we are. And we're going to talk a little bit about why. So this is just another example of, number 1, the awareness, the general awareness around supply chain was high. Number 2, this stuff happens, in the past, and we shouldn't be surprised. So, when thinking about risk in your supply chain, there are a couple that come to mind, for me at least. And one of the things that I'm going to suggest is every organization needs to understand what the global risks are. Once you understand what the global macro level risks, then you need to think about your own organization's risks. Once you've got those, then you actually need to apply the math and the probability to understand, because you can actually figure out what is the probability of an event happening, and is it enough to be, worried, to make you worry, so that you build a contingency. So Nord Stream 1, this is probably one of my biggest fears, is that the gas supply to Europe is shut off. We don't have an answer for it. 1/3 of all the gas that comes into Europe comes through Nord Stream 1. There's not enough supply around the world to backfill whatever gap that leaves. It would most likely put Germany and probably most of Europe into a recession. This is a real risk because part of it is just the unpredictability of what Russia is going to do next. I don't think many people really know what that next move would be. Number two is zero COVID. I mentioned earlier about Tesla and the risks that Tesla faces. This, the Chinese policy of zero COVID, basically saying, if we have a city where we have a certain number of people that get infected, we're shutting the city down. We're going to lock it down. As a result, number one, they don't have mass immunity in the country. Number two, those people aren't going to come to work. We're going to be facing rolling blackouts, if you will, throughout the country. And I will tell you that my suspicion is that Beijing is next. And so if you've got, interests in Beijing, if you've got manufacturing in Beijing, be really, really careful. Number three, government elections. I know that France just had their election, Marine Le Pen. She did not win, but she got more votes than she's ever gotten. And it's a good thing that my opinion is that had she won, she would have pulled France out of NATO, which would have had all sorts of other complications as far as overall, unity within the EU. It's hard to believe that 30 years ago, Europe signed the Maastricht Treaty that formed the EU, and how much that's done. And now, there's a through line there straight to Brexit. So the government elections, I'm scared to what is going to happen in the United States if, you know what I'm talking about. So if in the US the Congress goes back to a Republican-held Congress, nothing will happen in Washington for the next 2 years. And I think you'll see a whole lot of unhealthy behavior. And then if we actually elect that guy back into office in 2024, yeah, you can tell my feelings. I'm going to keep it. And then Taiwan and China. This is the last one I'll talk about. There are others, but should China invade Taiwan, it's going to be just good night as far as semiconductors. We think we got a problem today getting semiconductors. Imagine what would happen if China should invade Taiwan. 60% of the world's supply comes out of Taiwan. So be on the lookout. The message is understand what those global risks are. Then we're going to talk about what are the local risks. Well, that page didn't turn out. So what sort of risks do we face? Thinking about your own organization. Maybe it's a labor risk. Is there a threat of labor going on strike? Economic. Interest rates are going up. You can bet on it. Your prices are going to be going up. Inflation is real. Understanding what sensitivity your business has towards those price fluctuations is going to be super, super important. Environmental risks. So I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and anybody who lives in the South knows in the springtime you're going to get tornadoes. I mean, if you've got a manufacturing plant, you're going to build resiliency, expecting that at some point you're going to have some sort of a weather risk. Maybe it's a regulatory risk. In the US, it's the FDA, MHRA. What happens tomorrow if that should change? And these are just intended to be examples for you guys when thinking about what are the risks that I face in my own organization. Geopolitical risks, I'm not going to go into that. Leadership risks. What happens if I have a leader of my organization that goes sideways? What is that going to do to my supply chain? Maybe nothing, I don't know. Then you've got to calculate the probability of those risks. Not only of the individual risk, what's the probability of inflation, but taking that as a portfolio and understanding what does that mean for the entire business. So how do you control for it? Once you understand what those risks are, This is a U.S. reference, but it's a pro football coach. His name is John Gruden. He was the youngest coach to ever win a Super Bowl in the U.S. The point is what's in his hand, not John Gruden. The point was what is in his hand. This is his play. These are his set of plays for that particular game. A couple things that I'll call out. Number one, he designed the plays in advance. He wasn't trying to do it in crisis mode. So when you think about building playbooks, do it far in advance, when your thinking is clear and you're able to really consider what your options are. You can establish quantitative thresholds. At what point am I actually going to flip into this next play? So, in the US, this is a football analogy, but if it's the third quarter and it's, 2 yards to go, at 15 seconds, I know exactly what play I'm going to run. You define roles and responsibilities. You know who's responsible for doing what, should something like that happen. And you've practiced it. This can't be the first time that you're doing that. I heard somebody speak just recently saying that all of their ERP systems are set up with alternative suppliers. They've had it since the day they put it in, but they've never exercised that muscle. They've never actually sourced from that supplier. And it's inclusive of the entire supply chain. It's not just your playbook inside your own company. This is your playbook, and it's including your suppliers or your transportation providers. Redundancy. So if you remember the Henkel example about building that redundancy into your supply chain from the very beginning, how important that is to be able to have that plan B. I'm sure that the girl in the middle is not too happy, but and I market tested this. I have 3 daughters. I market tested. I said, am I going to offend anybody with this? And they said, yeah, you're not. So I believed them. Let me hear it. Okay, moving to private networks. Historically, when we look at the supply chain, we've followed this kind of one up, one down visibility model, meaning I know what my direct supplier is doing, and I probably know what my customer is doing, but that's not enough, because if I've got a multi-echelon supply chain, if something happens at tier 2, and I'm sitting at tier 6, I'm never going to know until it's too late. I ran a manufacturing plant. We were importing from China. All I could do was call my customs broker and say, where's my container? I actually had to shut down production. We ran 3 shifts, 6 days a week. I had to shut down production for a week because I didn't have my container and I couldn't see that it was delayed. So what we're doing at UST is we're building what I call a many-to-many trading network. So essentially, you're going to be able to connect everybody in that particular supply chain. You'll be able to make it permission-based, so not everybody can see everything that everybody else is doing. You can only see certain pieces of that information. And it's API-driven. One of the biggest challenges with building visibility is particularly when you work with suppliers in developing regions. They don't have the technology. They don't run SAP. You got to make it easier for them to get on board and share information. One of the things that we've produced is we call UST Omni, which is our visibility solution. So we can actually pinpoint exactly what's going on in your network. We can notify you when something's going wrong. But here's where it gets better. It's not just a notification that something's gone wrong. We actually have the artificial intelligence in that promotes back to you 3 or 4 options. You got a problem. Here are 3 options for you to solve that problem, or you could do nothing. And I'm going to tell you what the marginal impact to your cost and service would be if you were to make that decision. So let's say I've got a late delivery. It's going to be a week late, and I need it. One option, I could expedite from another supplier. Number 2, I could, borrow from another manufacturing plant, maybe a competitor. Number 3, I could do nothing. I could call the customer and ask for forgiveness. Typically, it would take about 5 months to put something like this together. Again, the biggest challenge is actually connecting all of those deep, level 2, level 3 suppliers in your network. Questions?
That was tremendously interesting and useful. I've got quite a few questions, but does anybody want to go straight from the floor? Down at the front, is Emily there? Oh, no, Jack's just getting the microphone for you. This is Sean Ashcroft, the Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Digital, by the way. I'll introduce you for you.
Good afternoon, Jonathan. Thanks for that. That was really insightful. I've been hearing a lot about a shift away from linear supply models to network-based supply models. I mean, Accenture been talking about demand response networks, and you're talking about something similar. Do you think the days of the linear supply chain are numbered?
No. No, I don't think that they're numbered. I think that we're always going to have a need to build strong relationships, and that's always going to take a level of commitment that this, crowdsourced type of a supply chain, it won't support that kind of. I think you'll see companies move towards vertical integration faster than they will to, some sort of a social network supply chain. I just don't. When I think about the complexity and the requirements, particularly if I'm in like pharmaceuticals, I need to know that what you're sending me is the real deal. One of the things that I didn't mention on the supply network, one of the things that we're doing is we're using the blockchain, not the crypto type blockchain, but when you actually get, let's say it's Levi's needs cotton. You need to make sure that you have an immutable chain of custody. You want to make sure that you know that that cotton didn't come out of a Uyghur region, that it came from a reliable source. You can then put your stamp of approval and say, I'm confident in what this material is. So blockchain is becoming much more important. I don't know whether I answered your question. I don't see the linear really going away. Do see is stringing that line into a many-to-many type of a relationship.
We've got another one. Yep, just there.
Thank you for that. That was really quite insightful. I was just wondering that we heard a lot about risks, and I haven't actually heard the word insurance. And I know that risk and insurance goes hand in hand. Is it because, I'm just wondering, I was just curious, that is it because the risk that we see in supply chain is quite difficult to calculate, or is there many factors for the underwriters? Like, what is the reason behind it? So I'm just curious.
Because we've never experienced this before, there's going to be a market for that. Anytime there's a need like that, there's going to be a market that develops. So I think you can. Today, if you're using commodities for your direct materials, you can hedge. You can hedge those positions fairly easily on the market. But for things like semiconductors, good luck trying to protect yourself from that. So I don't know whether you're familiar with Stanley Black & Decker. They make a lot of power tools. They told me last week that they're building their own fabrication manufacturing site because they don't want to face that risk.
I have some questions touching on the geopolitical factor. You were speaking about, well, first of all, sustainability. I think basically that comes down to being resilient in the long term on every aspect, and emissions is a part of that, but so is just flexibility. And as you say, plan for Murphy's Law. It's all going to happen at some point. First of all, do you view zero COVID? Do you think that long term it'll be viewed as a historical economic damper? Yeah.
So China has already told the world that they're not going to hit growth targets for this year. It will be, I think Xi Jinping said it at about 5.5%, and China has already come out and said this is not going to happen. And when China slows down, everybody slows down. And so I think it's a meaningful risk.
And then just on Taiwan, I think prior to Ukraine, the perspective was there's two big risks geopolitically in the world. One is Russia invading Ukraine. Second is China having a go for Taiwan, right? Now, maybe this has delayed it. China is also known for its long view. Do you think potentially its threat and the decentralization of semiconductor production from Taiwan may meet its own goals of unifying the Chinas without necessitating direct confrontation, without the West and particularly the US being so reliant on it?
Repeat the question. Do I think that...
Do you think that just by having the threat and forcing people to make their own semiconductors so they're not buying them from Taiwan, do you think that is going to... Do you think China might take the view that that'll achieve its objectives better than just trying to invade?
No. I think that China is still going to try to disrupt that market. There's too much leverage in there in disrupting the semiconductor. And we're so dependent on it. I mean, in everything that we do. So, you know, I would love to see India, for example, build manufacturing sites so they can make their own semiconductor chips. They're probably the next in line to do that. What that requires is deep engineering skills. And that's really where China's not been able to keep up with Taiwan, is having those engineering skills. So what do? They go out and make these job offers to the Taiwanese, and they recruit them into China. The one other risk that I would venture to speculate on is there's going to be a food crisis. If you think that 45% of all the wheat and grain comes out of Russia and Ukraine. Well, Ukraine's already said, we don't have the manpower, we can't harvest right now, we can't plant. So that's going to be taking a hit. Fertilizer is going to be in short supply. So feeding the world, and I'm not talking about London, I'm talking about the hungry people in the world, is going to become a big problem in the next 6 months, is my guess. And it's those people that work in factories that produce products that we are so reliant on. Sorry to be a downer. I'm not.
No. You're right to say it. It's going to happen in 6 months. We should be talking about it now. Jonathan, thank you so much.
Thank you.